Hello, I'm Tony Morbin, Editor-in-Chief at SC Media UK. I'm joined by Tim Erlin, VP Product Management and Strategy at Tripwire, a double winner at this year's SC Awards Europe. We're going to be discussing best practice in effective vulnerability management, including what's new and also what's not new but is still important. Now Tim, first off, hybrid networks. We've got all sorts going on. How do we manage all the data that's no longer inside our networks, and particularly when some of that data is encrypted?
They're in environments where there are expanding numbers of assets. There's increasing complexity. So it's not just that they have more to manage, but what they're being asked to manage is more complex. And they're being asked to do so with fewer resources. And that certainly applies to vulnerability management. As a practitioner, you have to start by understanding that the security control that you're trying to apply, vulnerability management itself, hasn't really changed. You still need to assess vulnerabilities. You still need to prioritize them. You still need to get those results. But the technology and techniques you might use to get that data may be different depending on the environment.
We've got all this data coming in from all these diverse sources. Okay, so now we're tracking it. How do we actually prioritize what we're going to remediate?
And prioritization is the biggest problem for vulnerability management specifically. So everybody is making a choice about what to prioritize first. How do you do that? That's really the key question. There are different ways to approach it, but all of them involve scoring vulnerabilities in some way. The classic approach of rating vulnerabilities on a high, medium, and low scale is really insufficient when you're talking about thousands and thousands of assets or servers in your environment. At that point, you need the ability to distinguish between different levels of risk at a much more granular way. There is, of course, the standard of the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, which gives you a 0 through 10 ranking. And in most environments, we find that customers might have hundreds or thousands of vulnerabilities that rate a 10. And if you can't fix all of those, then you need something even a little bit more granular. So we recommend a scoring system that takes into account 3 criteria. The level of access that vulnerability grants if it's exploited. So that ranges from it provides information only to it provides remote privileged access to an asset. The difficulty or threat environment in which that vulnerability exists. So that ranges from it's theoretical, nobody's ever exploited it, all the way up to it's been incorporated into an automated exploit. And then we add to that the time that's elapsed since that vulnerability was first publicly published. And the idea of that time component is that the longer a vulnerability's been in the public, the more likely it is that people are going to know about it and be able to exploit it. Mm-hmm. And so that increases the vulnerability risk over time. And that's important because in a situation where you have 2 vulnerabilities that are the same depth of access or risk and the same exploitability, you need a way to distinguish between which one of those you should fix today. If you only have resources to fix one vulnerability, which one? And that time component helps provide that distinction. So you end up with a very granular score that gives you the ability to prioritize very effectively across those 3 criteria.
So what does make a vulnerability management program effective?
So you can look at it in a couple of different ways. I often think about the habits that organizations have that make vulnerability management effective. So you would include in that case things like executive buy-in. And when I say buy-in, I really do mean that the executives have a vested interest in that vulnerability management program, not just a lip service towards it. What happens if vulnerability management as a program fails? Does it have actual objectives that are tied to an executive's compensation or job performance? That makes a big difference. You can also look at things like scan frequency and comprehensiveness. How often do they run scans? Is that frequency tied to a remediation cycle? You may have an organization that scans for vulnerabilities every day, but if they only remediate once a month or once a quarter, then that's not necessarily any better. Mm-hmm. So a rational scan frequency is certainly a requirement in there. So I think you can look at those kinds of habits. One of the key ones is also tying the vulnerability results to remediation. So is there a prioritization mechanism in place, and is it connected to a process that actually gets work done inside that organization? So there isn't one way to do it. You really have to understand how your organization works in order to be effective.
Tim, that's been a really interesting discussion. I'm afraid we've run out of time now. So our thanks to Tim Erlin for his expertise today, and thank you for joining us.